So we're just going down the line. Is that
Yeah.
what you said? Okay. All right. Question 1. So I really enjoyed the structure of the essay My Story. Was it always written in this format, or did it kind of evolve during the writing process?
No, it was not always written in that format. That actually probably has the most dramatic evolution story of all the essays, because it was originally in the collection that I wrote that won the award. They gave me like I think 3 months to revise, right? And so that essay was one I'd always felt uncomfortable about because it was a sort of straight narrative essay, chronological, about my sister and I and our relationship, and her having a child around the same time that my wife had a child, and then who was in custody of that child, and sort of the way that helped me, the way that got me thinking about what she meant to me and also what it meant to have a child. So anyways, after the collection was accepted, I sent that essay to her. I told her before that I had written about her, but I sent it to her and I said, look, this is gonna be in the collection that I'm writing, but I wanted your feedback. And she read it and responded and said, I hate it. She said, this is not true, like things didn't seem true to her, but also she said she felt like I came across as the good one and she is the bad one, which is, anybody has sisters and brothers, that's an issue. But then my sister also has dealt with addiction her whole life, right? So that's this sort of added dimension. So I said, okay. I mean, at first I didn't say that. At first I was like, no, I was resisting because like, who wants to rewrite an essay, right? But I said, okay, I'm gonna try to rewrite it. And so what I started thinking about in rewriting it was, what does it mean to tell a factual or true story about a family member, especially when it's a lot of it's in the past, when we have competing memories, but especially also when somebody has addiction issues and their reality is often different than your reality, right? But then on the other hand, she has a much better memory than I do. So I was just sort of thinking about all these aspects of trying to tell a true story, and also the ethics of telling a story at all, right? Which I think is something that any of us that write about, especially family, have to grapple with. So I knew one option would just be not to write an essay, but I felt like it was an important enough issue as somebody who, and there's so many of us in the world that have people with addiction issues in our family, that I think that's an important thing to try to write about from your perspective. But so I was thinking about, okay, how do I tell a true story? And then also, how do I tell a story that's not making me into the good guy or into the bad guy? And that is, because the one thing she said is, you have no right to tell parts of the story. So there are parts, she was like, that's not your story to tell. And so then I went back and thought about, okay, what is my story that I have the right to tell, and what is the story that I don't have the right to tell? And then when it came out, and the essay in the book actually is very much how I wrote it, almost in one sitting, was this sort of fragmented, essay where suddenly I wanted there to be different voices coming in, right? There's even like the voices from the movies that she used to watch, right? And then also the stories from being a journalist, because I felt like that was where this all started for me, this idea of wanting to tell a true story, right? And so, and what I tried to do in rewriting as well was implicate myself more than her, and think about what is it, what is my story? That was called my story,
yeah.
Right? What is my story in all this, and how do I tell it in a way that isn't it's about her partially, but really more about me.
Yeah. So was there like structure change that you actually made to that essay after you wrote it in that one draft?
I played a little bit, so I don't know if anybody's tried to write one of these sort of fragmented or like lyric essays, right? Where you're kind of making these leaps between sort of moments. So there were some parts where I played with the rhythm or what to include, but there wasn't a lot I changed. And I will say that I sent that essay to my sister then after I made the changes, and she said she loved it, which I don't think that necessarily gets me off the hook. I still think when you write about a family member, you just have to take on that ethical responsibility that you might hurt them, and you have to think about like why are you doing this, and is there a greater good for doing it, you know? But in that case, she actually felt like it was. She said, "You got it right." I love it. So.
That goes really well into the next question.
I mean, you've already been kind of talking about the familial relationships, but we're kind of wondering more about the close, like, intimate relationships with your wife.
Mm.
Do you dig a little bit deeper on that, please?
Yeah. So what about like writing about her,
like,
or
How did you?
Yeah. So like, how do you go about it, like from an ethical point of view?
Well, so I'm lucky in that my wife does not care what I write about. She just doesn't care. I didn't even want to write about it. Sometimes I mentioned something about her parents, and she's like, "You can't write about my parents." But I was like, "I don't want to write about your parents, right?" You know?
Yeah.
But besides that, she's always been okay with me writing whatever I want about her, and she's also a really good reader. So even though she's not a literature person. I mean, she was a literature person in undergrad, but she's a linguist. But she reads my work, and sometimes she'll say, that's not what I said, right? You know, like I'm actually writing an essay right now, sort of a magazine piece, and you know, when we remember dialogue, it's like you're like, I remember it this way, but so I remembered her saying something at a point, and she's like, that doesn't sound like what I said. And I was like, well, what do you think you said? And she said, I said motherfucker. I don't know if you can put that. But I was like, oh yeah, that sounds a lot more like you. You know, like she's really collaborative in that way of like allowing me, helping me to like hear her voice, right, to get her back in. And I think, so there haven't been ethical issues in writing about her.
I have a follow-up question to this. What if you want to write, let's say, about a family member, but you're not able to get that approval from them? You know, like there is no communication or there's a lack of. How do you create, you know, the space where you're able to do so and still be ethical to them?
So I think that's harder, right?
Right.
So I think that what you have to do is, I'm such a big advocate of this idea that as writers, creative nonfiction writers, we have to, each time we write like a new piece, think about what the ethics for us in that piece are, what are our ethical boundaries, you know? And it doesn't have to be this big thing that you do, but it's almost like what you do in daily life, you know? Like there's times when you think about, like, should I lie to this person or not lie, right? You know, and we think about what our moral code is. And so I think when we're writing about family members, and so I'll tell you a personal story related to that, but I'll just say also, like, working with students, I have a number of students, especially people that come from abuse, right, or just situations where the person wasn't a good person, right, and then that the person clearly didn't want to be written about. There's that dilemma because they're never going to want you to write about them, right? And so then I think what you have to think about is, why am I writing, right? And so that's what I ask myself a lot. I'm like, am I writing because I want some effect to this person, right? And then you don't write it, right? Because if you're writing because you're mad at your mom or something, and you just want to hurt her, like that wouldn't be ethical in my mind, right? But if you're thinking, I want to write about my mom because I think that having this story out there would help other people understand the complexity of their own relationship with their mom, then to me, I think you have to sort of say, okay, I have agreed, I decided that I'm going to deal with that, you know, pushback that I have. And I will also say though that sometimes people, I know from being a journalist, sometimes people don't get as upset as you think they will be, right? And I think sometimes the people you don't think will get upset, like I remember when I was a journalist, like somebody that I said that this guy, you know, I don't remember what it was, he was like picked up a stick and he's like, how dare you say I picked up a stick? Or so there was something really, really simple, but then I write like an expose about, you know, somebody that's done something really wrong in their got upset. So I just think you can't understand human nature and like how people are going to react. There's a writer named Jennifer London who wrote this essay that I really love thinking about writing about family members, and it was about her mother. And her mother was a very complicated person, as many mothers and parents are. And she published it somewhere, and then the mother was really upset. And it turns out the mother was also a copy editor, and so she sent the essay to her mother, and her mother did track changes on the essay. And then she published that essay, and I think it's a beautiful essay because if you can find, I guess that's the other thing I would say, is that if you can find ways to let those people have their voice be heard, I know maybe that's a little bit of what I was doing with my sister, I think it can at least take off some of that
So
edge.
if you wanted to, putting that person in the story versus like my child or naming that child to keep their identity, because it's my story, right, versus theirs. So for me, I have this dilemma of, do I name that person in my story, or do I keep them at bay and continue to just refer to them as my child? So I guess that's kind of like a play on this scenario that we're talking about. So just kind of curious.
Well, and with children, I think it's more complicated too, right?
Right.
Is, because your children, if you do write about your children, they have to grow up, right, and sort of live with those stories. Well, if their name is there, it'll always be attached to their name. And so I've always leaned towards not naming my children,
Right.
because it's not necessary, right? I think sometimes there might be moments where it just gets too confusing, but I think that if it's possible not to, I'm of the mind that if it's possible not to name somebody, it's for me it's better. If it's a touchy subject,
Right.
But the other thing I was going to say, I was thinking about this subject, is that I did in that original essay collection, I had an essay about my mom, who was and kind of still is dealing with alcoholism, and it had come on late in life, so it was a sort of bewildering experience, because I think people, they grow up with an alcoholic parent, that's one experience and not very fun, but it's also really bewildering to have a parent who seemed really stable your whole life suddenly become really unreliable and hard to trust. And so I had an essay about her, and I showed it to her, and she just freaked out and enlisted her brothers to call me, and really went on a campaign in which they said I would regret it. And I thought about it, and I decided that not because they were pushing me, but because I think that I was still angry. I still am angry at her. That's why I decided to withdraw it. Because it was different with my sister. I'm not angry at my sister. I was trying to understand that relationship. But with my mom, I just sort of questioned my motives. So.
Right. Good.
One of the things we've been talking about is your switch from journalism to going into nonfiction essay writing, and we kind of wanted to know what that process was like, and then also is there anything that's like influenced in your essay writing with journalism background?
Yeah. So I always thought I'd be a journalist, right? Like I'm trying to think when the first time that I was on my 5th grade paper, right? And I wrote about like local history in Madison, Wisconsin. And then high school I was in the newspaper, and I wrote exposés about pep rallies and how sexist they were. And then after college, I got a job at that small paper that I mentioned in some of the essays. And I really adored it. Like I thought it was like the best thing ever, because it's so immediate. It's like you write, people read it the next day. It sometimes actually affects the way things are happening, and the way the community, the issues that are in the community, and it feels like a service. And so anyway, so I thought I'd always be a journalist, but then what happened is I kept going to these bigger papers, and then Houston, I was there, and it just started to seem less like a service and more like a business, which is kind of what's happening in journalism. Had been happening. I think we have some hope now. While I was in Houston, there was no creative nonfiction or creative college. I went to a really small liberal arts college. We had lots of literature. I was a literature major, but I hadn't taken creative writing classes. And so, but in Houston, they have this sort of nonprofit called Imprint where they do workshops in the community. So it's usually like old, wealthy, retired people, and like me, I was like a 20-year-old. So I took a personal essay class, and in that personal essay class, I wrote the first essay in that collection. And part of the reason that I sort of left journalism is that I realized that essay I could never tell in a newspaper, right? That I could write about Robert Durst all I wanted, you know, like if he did something newsworthy. But to me, what felt like more alive and exciting was the fact that I lived with his furniture, and you know that I had this sort of really conflicted feeling of identifying with him, but then also knowing that he was probably a monster, and you know, like all these things that are just they're not supposed to be a newspaper. I mean, there's no place in newspapers. So that's why I left, and also because there were layoffs at the newspaper, and I felt like it wasn't an industry that would take care of me, or take care of anybody. So, but then I went to Iowa, which is the nonfiction program is known as like the home of the essay, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have John Nagata there, who's like an anthologist of the essay, and it's just like they live and breathe the essay there, right? And I, at that point, didn't even really know what the essay, I mean, I'd written these personal essays, but I hadn't really studied the essay. And I still thought of journalism as being a form of creative nonfiction, being within that spectrum. And I remember my first class, and it wasn't with John Nagata, it was with another teacher, but the teacher put up on the board, and he put art, and then he put journalism, and then he put like this line, and he's like, "We write art." And I was like, oh wow. You know, like, what did I get myself into? Because like, I love journalism. I think it's a really important form of writing. And so I struggled a lot in those, probably my 3 years there, trying to find my voice. Because what I wanted was to be able to use the skills and like the approach to the world that I learned in journalism, but to allow that you know, we talk about the essay sometimes being the mind on page. So allow that mind, which is totally excluded from newspaper journalism, to exist. And so it took a while to figure out how do I do that. And I think I think the journalism part of me is still there a lot. You know, one criticism I've got of this book is that people say that I'm not emotional enough, right? They think that like the way I've seen some reviews where they think that the way I talk about my own life, like I seem really distant. And I think the thing is that the beautiful thing about the essay is that it is about the voice of the person and the uniqueness of our voice. And my voice tends to be that sort of, there is a little bit of distance and that sort of journalistic perspective. But yeah, I recommend journalism classes for anybody. Just as like, if you get a chance to take a journalism class, I think it's really helpful for developing those skills of being able to like interview. Although clearly some people are already interviewing like crazy, right? 36 interviews is great, but yeah, I think it was a really great foundation. And at the end, I had a lot less fear than other people in my program about doing sort of work out in it, you know, doing any sort of interviewing. You know, other people came in and they were good writers, but they would just be scared to death of like interviewing their neighbor or anything like that. And so.
So we had talked about how impressed we are by your vivid descriptions and ability to bring your readers into the scene with you, especially in the essay My Hands. What is your observation process like? And do you treat your observations as like field work, like taking notes or third-party observation instead?
I'm a big journaler, so I journal, right? Yeah. And so, and I don't do it with the mind of like, oh, I'm going to use this, right? But what I often do, going back to pieces, like that My Hands piece that I wrote, I remember going back and thinking, okay, I had this one girlfriend at the time, and it was a sort of scene where like we're like in the kitchen and we're making something, we're making some sort of soup, right? And our hands had been touching, and I didn't remember that. I just was like thinking about the timeline of when I was at Iowa, and with my hands, and I looked back through my journal, and I had written about that moment, right? And so sometimes what's really helpful for me is just to go back through the journal, and then certain things just seem alive in a way that I probably didn't even realize at the time that I was writing the journal. So yeah, I do that. I sometimes take notes, but not as often in a moment. I think that's something that I always wish I was better at. There's people that carry like a little notebook around, and every time something significant happens, they write it down.
Right.
My personal goal is to pay attention to. So Joan Didion talked one time about shimmering images. That when images shimmered, that meant that there was like something alive there, right? And people have said other sort of terms for that idea. But sometimes we don't pay attention to that because like we feel that there's some sort of energy or heat or whatnot in whatever moment we're in, but we don't pay attention to it and we go on, right? So I do write on my phone and that notes things in my phone, but mostly it's going back through my journal. And the piece I'm writing now, this magazine piece, there was a day I was writing about, and I just remembered sort of the bare minimum, right? And there's nothing specific that would make the day come alive. And we were at a party, and I looked back at my journal, and I had written about how my older daughter was jumping on the bed with this other girl at the party, and I came in, and the room was just covered in toilet paper, like everywhere. There was like toilet paper, like on the bed, on the floor, and I was like, what is going on? Like, and I thought about like, did they pee their pants? Like, were they like replicating snow? Like, what were they doing? And then the little girl said, we're trying to pull out Nico's tooth, which I was like, I never would have guessed that, like I never. And the essay I was writing, that was about how you need to know all the facts in order to be able to tell a story. And so that ended up being this moment where I was like, oh my God, that's a perfect metaphor, but it's also so specific and weird that it makes the experience come alive. And I think that's what I'm always looking at for, is something that's specific and weird enough or different enough that it feels unique to life.
So our next question, we really enjoyed the juxtaposition you had with your personal experiences and whatnot with historical events. And we were just wondering what made you choose to format your essays in that type of way. And then an add-on, what are some suggestions you can give to us if we want to kind of immerse ourselves like that as well?
So, are there specific examples you can think of that, like, where the historical events? Like,
Well, for like about the Dooley,
Yeah. Okay.
like song and
Yeah.
Frontier Child.
So, I love research, as you might be able to tell. I think research is really exciting. And I think research can do two things. One is you can begin with like what you want to write. So like the Tom Dooley essay, I knew I wanted to write about singing this murder ballad to my daughter because it felt wrong in some way. It felt like there was something, not wrong, but it felt like there was something complicated about that, and I felt sort of bad about it, because it was such a violent song, an anti-female woman song. And so what I did was just research into that, right? And so, because I grew up singing that song because my parents really liked folk music, but I had no idea that it was even a real story or anything like that. So I researched into that, and then researched the story of Tom Dooley, and researched the story, and then started researching lullabies, right? And Lorca has this, which I put a little bit in, but like this sort of speech she gave about lullabies and like how they're actually about the mother, right? Sort of trying to speak her pain and all the sort of complicated feelings she has about having a child. So I think research can be really good. It's like if you know what you want to write about, but you don't know where to go, it's just to research into it. As much as you can, take tons of notes and then try to figure out what's most exciting. And then the other thing though I've done though is sometimes just a research subject seems interesting, right? So the one about, so so they all had titles, or like different titles where they were published. And I was thinking about the one about my wife that's about my language, which is about like, so that was originally about listening to this Doctora Isabel and like learning Spanish. And then I started, like, just because of that, it wasn't really about an essay, I started looking into advice. Because I was like, this is so weird, this like advice thing. Like, we're gonna do, like, how long has it existed? And I found like and none of it got included in the essay, but like the, first advice column that came out in England, it was like this, they were like a philosophical society. It was supposedly like, they didn't know who they were, but they were like these old smart men, that you could then write into, and they would tell you what to do, about the woman that you liked that had spurned you, or something like that. And then from there, I started thinking about like prophecies and like, foretelling the future. And so I just did all this research, too much. I think there's a point where you have to be like, stop. But it was because I knew there was something interesting research-wise there, and really it was only like as I did all that research and like I had an essay that was basically all research, and I workshopped it and people were like, yeah, this is really interesting, but like where's the heart? Like what's happening? And then I started thinking about that process of learning Spanish and how uncomfortable but sort of beautiful it is, and then that process of like falling in love and it sort of only got there because I'd done all that research. So yeah, so then like advice about research.
Yeah, so if like we wanted to like immerse research within our narratives as well, like what's the process to do that?
I guess without losing the heart of it, right?
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, I think it's good to allow yourself to fail a little bit, right? So like if you have the heart of something, I would try to research a lot, right? Because the more you research, the better you're gonna know the subject. It doesn't matter. And what you often need is to do a lot of research, maybe put in too much, give it a little distance. I'm a big fan of the idea of like writing something and giving it time. So it might not be for this class, like what you turn in this class, it might not be that it's quite ready, right? And then give it a little time, come back, and then I always realize, oh, this is too much research, right? This is where I need to take it out. And also, you allow it to sort of sink in and become natural, because that's the thing about research is that when you first do it, the way you write about it just sounds robotic, right? Because what you've been reading is usually really research voicey. It's not your voice. And so sometimes you have to give it time to like almost become your own knowledge and then be able to write about it. So yeah, time, it's hard. But you'll never go wrong with research. You'll just learn new things.
Right, absolutely.
What was it, my turn now? Oh, sorry. I forgot we were at the end of the line. Was a book publication always part of your like career plan or like your path?
No. I mean, I was a journalist. So my original goal was just like, I wanted to write that like long form journalism, but in newspapers, a job in Houston was like, I was the youth affairs reporter because I was young, so they thought I could like cover young people. But through that, I got to write some longer form pieces. Like I wrote a piece about this woman who had been born with ambiguous genitalia, and she was actually genetically male, but identified as a woman and wanted to get reconstructive surgery. And I'd written about that in college, and I've always been really interested in this idea of intersexuality and what does it mean to be intersex, and how does that sort of complicate gender. And so I was able to, I think her mother wrote me because she wanted somebody to know her story, and so I ended up following her through her surgery and talking to her a lot about that process of like, what does it mean to feel like a woman, right, for her. And so I got, that was kind of my goal, and I wrote that piece, and things like that were sort of that's what I wanted to do. But then when I left there and went to grad school, I was sometimes like, everybody wants to write a book. I was like, oh, that's what you have to do. This is what we're all trying to do. And I did it. It took me a while to get with the program. Like I was interested in essays, and I was like, this seemed like a fun thing to do. And so I wrote essays, And then I had actually a book project because, I mean, you have to write a thesis at the end. So I had a book project about Guatemala. I had an agent and, you know, it seemed like it might become something. And then I did that sort of ethical reevaluation that I think is important. And I realized that I didn't feel like I could tell a story. I mean, it wasn't exactly about Guatemala, but it was partially about my relationship with Guatemala. I had gone there when I was in high school as like a mission trip when I was still like a Christian, and then I'd gone to learn Spanish, and then I'd gone back and volunteered, and I'd gotten really interested in the history of Guatemala. But I just sort of realized like it's not really my story to tell. Like I think there are Guatemalans that could tell stories about Guatemala in a probably better way. Or if I'm going to do this, I have to dedicate a lot more time to it. So I wrote that entire book and then put it in the drawer, as they say, and then said, well, what do I do now? And then my wife got this job in Lubbock, Texas, and I went there. We went only because I have a PhD in creative writing, and I did that, and then it was there that I wrote more essays, and suddenly I said, oh, I think these actually do form a book. And that's when I fell in love with the essay collection and started thinking about it more, and like what a beautiful thing it is. You know, I mean, I think we think books sometimes, and it's like, oh, I have this one project that this one idea that I'm trying to figure out, and that is really cool. But I like the way an essay collection is like bringing together these different stories, and they collectively kind of tell a story, right? But they all tell their own individual story. I really sort of fell in love with it, and so yeah, somewhere along that line, I realized that that would be a goal to try to write a book. And now the goal is to write another one. That's just that's what happens, I guess.
Sticking with like the theme of journalism, we were wondering, how did your journalistic background kind of inform what you felt you could include or what you felt you had to like omit in the chapter My Choice?
So yeah, that is the only essay that is based on an actual reported piece I did. You know, like I don't even think I wrote anything about Durst. Maybe I did some small thing about Durst, but that was the only, I think I wrote something about Tarpons, but that was like the only one where it was like, it almost felt like I'm rewriting, you know, what I wrote as a journalist. And so what did the journalistic training, how did that affect me as I was thinking about like?
Yeah, like what you felt you could include or like you needed to exclude.
Right. I think that was one where I felt like I had a lot of leeway because the people, well, the father and son, had talked to me on the record, had been fine actually using their full name, and I think in my essay I only used their first names, right? And so the thing about journalism is that there's this contract, right? When somebody talks to you on the record, that is now public record, right? And so I felt like I could tell that part of the story, right? And I felt like, again, when I think about ethics, like it felt like that was a particularly important story to tell, because we're learning more about these, and luckily these sort of conversion programs are less common, but it felt like we rarely have a sort of insider view, and I wasn't able to give that perspective when I wrote the newspaper piece, right? And so being able to talk about, or trying to talk about how hard it was, like the way that in some ways I felt like it was a primer on growing up in a fundamentalist family and like what it might have been like if I had been gay and grown up in a family like that. It seemed like an important story, and so yeah. I mean, I think that part of my ethical deliberation in that was, and also creative, was thinking about how do I restructure what was just sort of a newspaper story and give it the life of an essay. And part of it for me felt like Lanny, which is the son, because in the newspaper stories it was a father, because the father was, he was doing all the action, and like he was also just so, he talked all the time, and he just like, he did these things that were more newsworthy. But Lanny felt to me like the one that broke my heart, like reporting it. It was just, so yeah, I wanted to be able to capture him in a way. And also he broke my heart, but he also made me think, right? Like I think that's a thing about that didn't get into the newspaper piece, but that I tried to get into the essay, is that it's a complicated issue, right? I mean, the rhetoric of these conversion programs is like, oh, it's a choice, therefore anybody can choose, right? But the sort of antithesis is that is this idea of like, oh, it's a genetic thing, so you're born with it, so it's like a genetic defect, right? And so I think that I've always been of the mind that like, well, maybe it's a choice, but I would still choose it because I love being queer, right? So I think that's important. And so I think I was trying to give Laney's perspective breathing room and like really sort of understand it in a way that maybe I couldn't have in the newspaper article.
And then just kind of quick follow-up. Now, granted, journalism versus publishing a book, there's a lot of different rules there. But because it is a kind of professional thing, was there kind of like a degree of self-censorship when wanting to publish this specific essay?
Self-censorship for the essay itself?
Yeah, for that specific one.
How so? Like, I don't
Like, were there other things that you still couldn't put in there? Like, you felt like you couldn't?
I know that I think the thing I was nervous about was making it look like all journalists are just super subjective, because I didn't want to give journalism a bad name, and that kind of was my point, that we're all subjective, but I also think journalism is so important and it's under attack, and so I think that there had been, in an original version, there had been a little bit more about this idea of subjectivity and like what I what I wanted to write, or how I tried to like maybe manipulate what I was writing, so that it felt more right to me or something. And I just sort of backed away from some of that, because I didn't want it to, I mean, I don't think that the religious right is going to read my book, but if if somebody did, I just didn't want to give them fodder for that sort of those sort of opinions. Although I will say about that essay, that is the only essay that I've published somewhere and have been really upset with the site of publication. So it was published in an online essay site, and they had the right to change the title. And so the original title, I think it had been something like, it probably wasn't very good, but it was something like Unchanged or something like that. And they changed it to When a Lesbian Reporter Walks into a Pray Away the Gay Conference. And like question mark, it was like a joke, like when somebody walks into a bar, like the way they put it, and I was livid. And I wrote to them and I was like, that sounds like a joke. Like, you're just basically making my situation, and also just a situation of somebody who's in that position, like, into a joke. And they didn't get it. They were like, they're thinking about clicks, I mean, they were thinking about, and I was so mad. I was like, I will never publish this place again. I was really upset. So, I mean, that's the only time. Usually places are really good and really considerate of writers, but it is something to think about if you start publishing, is thinking about like, okay, is this a place that's going to treat my work well?
When you're writing, you talk a lot about like your past personal loves. So specifically, like the bass fisherwoman. How do you put yourself back into that previous like emotional and mental state in your memory work? And do you avoid going back to previous intimate places and write more from a mature and distance perspective?
That's good. So, yeah, I think it's hard. I'm writing a book. My book right now is about high school. So I've been going back to high school, and it's so traumatic. It's just like, and I'm reading my journal from high school, and I just I start to squirm because I just feel so uncomfortable remembering the self I was. So yeah, I don't think it's very comfortable to do that, but sometimes it's good to remember that. I think with the bass fisherwoman, my first real girlfriend, I think that was one of those experiences where the emotional weight of that just was hanging with me, you know, like it wasn't going away. And so it wasn't like, it wasn't hard to get back there, because basically I probably needed to get back there and like write something and figure it out. And so it felt very, very immediate. But yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, they always talk about this idea of like when we're writing, we have multiple eyes, right? But there's like the voice of experience, the voice of innocence, right? And so I think that it's kind of it's about modulating those, and trying to allow yourself back into that voice of innocence sometimes, if only to get the vulnerability that you felt. But then the reader really needs that voice of experience, because otherwise you're just going to be sort of annoying. So, have you guys read Ryan Van Meter's First? You ever read Van Meter? So whenever I teach that and I think about that, I teach this essay. It's really short. You can look it up online. It's called First, and it's about when he's a gay author, and it was just a moment when he was riding home with his best friend in a station wagon. He and his best friend, they were like kindergarten, were sitting in the back seat, like on the station wagons where you used to like look back. And the father's in the front seat and the mother's in the second seat, and they're there. And he starts, you know, he goes back and forth the past, and he thinks about like when he watched soap operas with his mom, and through soap operas he learned about marriage and love, and he'd been thinking about it. And then he describes, the reason I was saying the innocence thing is that he describes so well what it's like to be a little kid. Like he talks about his relationship with the kid. He's like, Jimmy was, you know, he didn't go to my school because he went to a school where the kids have to use uniforms, but you know, his little sister was friends with my sister. It was a kind of the logic that you have at that age, which is hard to remember. But then basically at this moment he asks the little boy to marry him, and then the parents over here, and the mom turns around and he describes her in slow motion, and the mom was like, you don't do that, right? And so sort of this first moment of shame. But then so then the essay ends, and at the very end he said, you know, the parents were looking in front of them, but all I could see was what we left behind. And it was this moment where it's like suddenly you hear the adult, you know, you hear this adult being like, wow, you know, how much did that affect me, right? And continue to affect me. So yeah, I think finding both those voices is important.
Let's see here. Other than deadlines, at what point in the editing, proofreading process do you step away and move on to the next section? And then do you have a personal set of criteria for knowing when a piece is finished? That's so hard.
That's so hard. Oh man. I mean, for me, I feel like I can feel when a piece is not finished. Sometimes I try to fool myself and say that it is, but there's that little voice that's like, no, it's not. What are you doing? And so what I try to do if I can is just give it that time, right? Like so to walk away and then come back to it. Especially if I can come back to it with something new, because that's usually what it needs, right? Like usually what's happening if it doesn't feel quite right is that it's missing something. Whether it's like another element or a turn, or maybe there's emotional depth you haven't dug into, right? And so, you know, I'll try to step away and come back. When you asked about like within the piece itself though, like moving from section to section, when does it feel like?
Yeah, you know, like now you know, like you know how, for example, your essays that you've completed, and you move on to the next, right? You know, when do you know when that completion is? You know, as you said, probably because you know, like you feel like you've said as much as you possibly can at that point.
Yeah.
Just has there been a point where you've gone back and said, oh, wait, maybe I should add a little bit more or less or?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Well, so even that, my choice essay that we brought up earlier, the way it was really originally published was different, and it didn't ever quite feel like it was right. And so I came back to it when I published the book and tried to figure out like what was it actually about, and I sort of structured it into 3 acts, and I focused more on like the girls at the end and this idea of like the choices that a writer makes. So it became more about choice rather than change. Before it had been about change, it's sort of like the thematic core, and then I started thinking about choice, which they're related, right? But they're slightly different.
Are you ever conscious of who this is for? Like as far as who you're writing for, and who's going to be reading this, and who, that kind of direction, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, I mean, there's always different people have different sort of ideas about what to do with this. I've always liked the idea, and I think this is what I do automatically, is that like you have that sort of ideal reader, somebody you want to impress, right? And so sometimes it's that, right? Like sometimes it's if I'm thinking about the writing itself, right? There's somebody I know, or even sometimes a writer that I love that's like not dead, but like if they had read the piece, like would they like it? As sort of that ideal piece. But other times it's specific, right? Like so then my choice, I was thinking about my sister, right? Like even though I'm thinking about the audience and I'm thinking about whatever, like when I read that revision, it was like, will this feel fair to her, right? And so, but yeah, I think it helps to have some sort of audience in mind, and that was one thing that was really nice about moving from journalism, where like the Houston Chronicle has a huge, readership, and so like I would just be trying to imagine like the readers, and I had no idea who they were, and like they would get upset with me, and I just hadn't anticipated the way they would read things, and so it's nicer when you have like a smaller audience, and you can think about, okay, how will this be perceived? But yeah, I think having something to shoot for, or having people you really admire, or writers that you think are great, is helpful. And thinking about wanting to impress those people, even if they'll never read it.
So in a few reviews of your book, some common themes were that it was about ownership and loss. Can you talk a bit about how you feel you came to write about those two?
Yeah. Well, so one thing about a collection that's interesting, right, is that like you're bringing together disparate sort of pieces, right? And thinking about how they speak to each other. And so when this collection started to come together, I had maybe 2/3 of the essays already written, and I thought, well, what are they saying together? Like, what do they mean? Like when they speak together? And I thought about, okay, I'm kind of obsessed with like weird characters sometimes. Maybe that's not like a thematic enough, like. I sometimes like at one point I thought maybe it should be called stalker, because I feel like I like this stalking like impetus, like where I'm just sort of like stalking a subject or a person or something. And then at some point it was already called My Murderous Futon, and I think there was another one that also was sort of possessive, and I just think about that word mine, which is also a verb. And it's, it could also be like a mine, like explodes, like there's just so many ways that mine can exist. And I really love that sort of multidimensionality of the word. And so that became sort of the defining word that I thought of, right? And it exists in different ways. But then obviously the possessive is kind of what's implied there. And so through that, I just started thinking, I wasn't thinking about the possessive really consciously in those early essays, even though in My Murderous Futon I clearly was, like this, what does it mean to own a piece of furniture that somebody else owned? But I sort of started tweaking the essays to like think about that as like a lens through which to understand everything, and at that point I just had kids too. So I was putting the book together after having kids, and having kids definitely makes you evaluate the possessive and what you own. And what is yours, because suddenly your life is not really yours. Like before, I taken up and moved anywhere, right? You know, like there was nothing that, I had no real responsibilities. I mean, I was married, but you could have gotten divorced, right? Like there's just, you know, those are sort of things that can change. But when you have a kid, your life has changed. Like that child is yours always, right? And so I think it just made me think about the possessive in a different way. And so by the time, that was when we had our first daughter that my wife gave birth to, and then our second daughter, who I gave birth to, is the last, the coda in the book. By that point, I had already written the book. That coda actually wasn't in the book that was accepted. It was something I wrote afterwards. And I was already thinking about that, and so then it almost became the lens through which I wrote that, you know, because I started to think about it. It had never been something that interested me before, right? This idea of possessions, like I'm not really into possessions, right? But it became a sort of useful way of conceit for approaching the subject overall. But I think sometimes, you know, as we're writing, like sometimes we talk about poetry and we talk about constraints in poetry, right? Like you might write a sonnet, right? And you have to like follow this, you know, particular meter and rhyme scheme and number of lines and whatnot. And sometimes it's helpful as writers to do that to ourselves, even if we're not poets, right? Or if we're not writing poetry, and just think, okay, I'm gonna write within this box, whatever it is, right? Or this through this conceit, and just sort of use that, and it will often create interesting work, because it's nice to have boundaries. I think it's helpful.
So there were kind of like a couple of authors that you touched on, like you talked a lot about Joan Didion. So we were just kind of wondering like who influenced your writing and this kind of like approach that you took to this book.
So definitely Joan Didion. Actually though, like I think the first creative nonfiction or essayist I read where I realized that there was something essayistic happening even before I had that word was Anne Carson, who I read in college. And I read this collection of hers called Plain Water, which is called poems and essays, right? But there's this line, I'll try to remember the whole line, but there's this line in the book where she's like, something about like, this is how things are held together, your pear, my winter. And she was talking about this idea that, I think she was talking about, I mean, she's there's definitely different ways of reading her, but I think in that moment she was talking about this idea of like, when you create a work, whether it's a poem or an essay or whatnot, you bring these different parts together, you know, like you bring my sister's story and my story, or the story of Lanny and me, and suddenly they're hanging together, like his pear, my winter, and they're totally different, but by being together they're telling like something that's new and interesting. And so yeah, Anne Carson was really, really influential. And then in college, in grad school, I read Hilton Als. You guys read Hilton Als' essays? So he's like a culture. So because I feel like these are sort of different. We have different sort of strands. So like Anne Carson is like poet, lyric essayist, right? Joan Didion is like this journalist with with an incredible voice, right? Like I think what you get from Joan Didion is her voice, and also her sentences are just incredible, right? There's just a way that she's able to capture, and there's a distance to her emotion too that's just really amazing. And then Hilton Als, and then other sort of line of creative nonfiction, I think, is like these cultural critics, and so he writes a lot about like cultural icons or film or he has an essay about Richard Pryor that's really great, right? And it's so, even though I don't do that work, like I don't really do that kind of work, I really loved seeing how he interacted with the material differently. And he also has this sort of way of moving through an essay that's surprising, and so that the turns are, you aren't sure what will happen. And then in grad school also Eulabis, have you guys read Eulabis? Yes. Okay. So I think she is such a master of this, it's not really the lyric essay form, but it's just this idea of being able to juxtapose a surprising or unlike moments, right? And like have that come together. And so, but also what I love about her is that she was a social activist. Like she's trying to think about something. In Notes from No Man's Land, she's trying to think about something that is important in the larger society and figure it out. And I think that was sort of really influential.
So when you're deciding to write about your children, what kind of thoughts kind of run through your mind that you either do or do not want to put on the page?
Well, I don't want to embarrass them, right? I used to have a blog about my kids called My Queer Familia, because it was Spanish at home and more queer family. And I stopped when my daughter turned 3, my older daughter, because it felt like up until 3, like she wasn't really like a fully formed person, right? Like but at 3, like kids start to be actual people, right? And it's sort of, I felt like I didn't feel right sort of having her stories there. And so now, what I try to do is that they are always, it's sort of if they're in there, it's anecdotal, right? Like, so this essay they wrote now, Nico's on the bed, her tooth has fallen out, right? And they're, trying to pull her tooth out. I don't think that'll be embarrassing, right? And she actually knows I write about her and she's excited. I know that she'll always be excited. I know, like, I've heard writers talk about, like, their kids at some point saying, you can't write about me anymore, right? At some point they say, don't do it. Then you also have to respect that. But at this point, I don't, I haven't faced, we're talking about this idea of like having a non-binary child, or if your child is struggling, or I know people have written about children with disabilities, like all these moments where suddenly there is a large story in that child's life that is also part of your life, and I haven't had that yet because luckily there hasn't been anything that is a sort of scary or huge or big moment related to them, and I don't know how we'll handle that. I mean, I think the thing is, you just always have to go through that ethical process, right, of thinking. So right now, basically, I just try to be anecdotal when moments happen that are related to the larger story I tell, but they're not the center of that story. But I don't know if that will always be the case, right? And I think it's good to check in with the child, because once they get to be a certain age, they can speak, right? They can say, like, I don't want to be part of this, or I do. Or I think there's a book where a mother of a trans child, they both wrote part of the book. Have you heard of this? Sometimes there's other options too. This idea of like letting the person have voice, right? There's a poet I know from Iowa where she let her daughter write some parts of her poems, so parts of her book have like poems from the daughter, which I think is cool, right? So I mean, if you can if your child is interested, that's another option too.
I think, like, going off of that, did you feel like you were taking a risk on the essay My Child by linking your story to the stories of maternal filicide, or just by presenting them in a sympathetic way?
I don't know if I thought I was taking a risk. I mean, I guess it was a risk because I know, like, people don't. What I try to write about is when I feel differently than most of the world, right? And so that's when I was like, oh, this is probably interesting. But that means that most of the world will not necessarily be. They'll be like, what are you talking about? Like, why are you feeling sorry for these women who killed their children? And so, yeah, I guess there's a risk there that you might push away audience members, but to me, it felt really important to acknowledge. I think for a while I felt angry. I think soon after, becoming a mother, I felt angry at the way that we particularly demonize women that kill their children in a way that we don't necessarily demonize somebody else that kills other people, right? And it's this idea of like, oh, it's unnatural, it's inhuman, like, and we sort of, we create a specific category to them that feels unfair or unthoughtful, and so that's what I wanted to do, was try to pick about like what are the there's something there, right? What are the emotions there? I think the risk might be with my daughter. Well, not with my daughter, but with the with children in general. Is like, so I know Nico, my older daughter, is like sometimes said she's interested in reading, my work. She started to read. I know she won't get through. I mean, she reads like small chapter books. Like I think that she would get really bored in my book, but probably at some point she will. And it is dark, right? A lot of the material is dark, and I'm not sure how well she would be able to process some of that darkness. It feels like sometimes it's adult material. So I guess, there is that risk. But as far as the risk of writing about dark things, or unsavory characters with sympathy, I have always been of the mind that like if we can empathize with everyone, we should try, right? And then that exercise, especially as writers, is really important. And I know people, I mean, I've had reviews where people like, Goodreads reviews or whatever, where people have said like that they couldn't believe the things I wrote about. Like they sort of judged me for that. Like they were like, what's wrong with you? You're writing about like, picking your hands and murders and, women who kill their children. And I think it's just because, I mean, it's probably one reason I went to journalism. I was always interested in those people that we just decide are not worth our attention, right? These people that we decide are outside of our sympathies and not part of the human race, that those are the people that I think that we need to write about, so.
So our final question we have for you
These good questions.
is, do you feel like when you write, you have to write to get things correct or just right? Because in one of your essays, you mentioned how you stayed up late because you got the eye color wrong from someone, and so you had to call the editor and have them fix it. So with now you're more like personal essay writing, do you still have that same mentality, or are you more free to being wrong?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I'm like, what is right and what is, because I think that when I was a journalist, right was, did I get the eye color right? And that was like, it was very simplistic, and so I was obsessed with it because it was easy to figure out, right? Did I do this, get this fact right? Now it feels like it's trickier because it's like, did I get the essay about my sister right? I don't know, So yeah, I still think it's something that I think about a lot. It's like, am I telling the story the best way I can tell it, and also the most honest way? That's something I've sort of switched with, and I don't know if I said that in that essay or not, but I used to think as a journalist, like, oh, am I being factual and truthful? And there's such complicated words, like facts do exist, but what facts do you include, right? And truth does exist, but often it depends on the facts. And so what are the facts that are sort of bolstering that truth? And I read this essay with Kiese Lehman. You guys read anything by him? Okay. Oh, such a good book.
Yes.
So after that book came out, he was talking about that. Somebody asked him that same question about about being truthful or whatever, and he said, I don't think I can be truthful. All I can do is be honest, and so I try to be honest. And that was really helpful for me because I think that's true. Like, honesty is something we do understand. Like, and also honesty also implies like an audience, right? Like, I'm going to be honest to you. Like, even if they're imagined audience, like I'm going to try to be as honest as possible, and then I can get my head around. And so that is important. That is something I'm obsessed with. Like, am I being honest, right, with myself about the story, blah blah blah. But with honesty, I don't think there's a right and a wrong necessarily. Like, you can feel like you got it as close as possible, right, to right, but it's not the same as getting that eye color right, correct or not. So, yeah, it's hard work, but good work.
I do have one other question. Because you started in journalism, and I believe maybe it's easier to do the research and to slap this, put this information on paper. But when you have to bring in your own emotion to the paper, did you ever feel a time when it was hard to do that because you're so conditioned in a way to write about those facts, and you're kind of hiding behind the facts because that's the facts, right?
Yeah.
Versus bringing in yourself and trying to create something where, you kind of answered this a little bit earlier, but just trying to get this idea of, because I find in my own writing that I'm like looking at facts and so much and research that you lose a part of yourself when you're giving so much of that in there.
Right.
So just curious, and for you, like how the difficulty, how you overcame it
Yeah.
to find the ability to put yourself there.
Yeah. Well, I think at first I actually was really into, because I'd been holding myself back for so long. When I first started writing, I was all about it. But I actually wasn't showing that much because I'd been nothing. I'd been like non-existent in what I wrote before, and then suddenly I was like, oh wow, I can exist. And so at first there wasn't an issue of like, oh, I feel uncomfortable talking about myself. But then as I kept writing, and basically the self or the life I wanted to talk about were more shameful or complicated or whatever things, then yeah, I struggled a lot because because it was exposing, right? You know, I was the hardest essay for me personally was the essay My Namesake, which is about being sexually abused by my half brother. I mean, that's essentially what it's about, but the whole essay, you know, like that's when we talk about research, right? Like there's all this research about like, you know, Sarah and the Bible and like my mom and like all these things, but really what I was, at some point when I was writing that essay, I realized like what I'm working towards is like the fact that that sort of reading of the Bible freaked me out and reminded me of this thing that happened with my brother, and it needs to be in this essay, but I really don't want it to be, right? And so I wrote versions of that essay where that was not in there, and it was just about like my mom's infertility and like, you know, me maybe want to have a baby, but it felt dishonest, right? Because so I eventually put it in there, and that was hard. And actually my half brother's mother, so now my dad's ex-wife, read the book and wrote me after the book came out. I was at AWP, this writing conference, and she was really excited that I wrote a book because she's like into writing, blah blah, and she described like the actual experience of reading that essay and coming to that moment where she realized that like her son had harmed me, and she talked about being devastated, and then she like talked about like working through it, and she talked about the Me Too movement, and she like did all this stuff, and it was really hard to read because it was like I could feel her position. Like I have kids, like what would happen if your kids did something harmful to somebody else? Like that's hard, you know? And it was a moment where I was like, oh wow, that what I wrote actually does have implications, right? I made a decision to be open about something that is going to have implications in the world, and I sort of had to grapple with that and be like, okay, it's done, I can't change it, but I feel good about it. I think it's important. I think like it was important for me to do that, but yeah, it's a process.
Thank you.
Thanks,
so
guys.
much.
Those are great questions. Applause for you.